So we're going to start by looking at the evolution of the business environment. In particular, we're going to start by focusing on what's come to be known as the traditional view of the business environment, and this will then set the stage for subsequent videos in which we're going to look at the more modern version of the business environment, or the more modern view of the business environment, and that is the ecosystem. We're going to start here with some key terms in the traditional view of the business environment. In the second part of the video, we'll then move on to actually discussing and explaining what the traditional view consists in. And then finally, we're going to look at Porter's 5 forces as one of the most important and one of the most powerful explanatory frameworks for the traditional view of the business environment. So let's start then with these definitions. We're going to look first at the market. This is a really important component of the traditional view of the business environment. And a market is simply the nexus or the network of all the buyers and sellers of a particular good or service. So you might talk about, for example, the market for smartphones. You might talk about the market for a particular kind of food item. You might talk about the market for clothing, and so on and so forth. So there are various kinds of markets, and the market is basically just the collection of all of the buyers and sellers of that particular good or service. Secondly, then, we have the term industry. Now, these are terms that you might think you understand, but it's actually worthwhile really reflecting on them and what exactly the differences are between them as well. An industry can simply be defined as the whole process of the production of particular goods and or the provision of particular services. A good way of thinking about this in distinction to the market is that the industry actually serves the needs of the market. And so in some senses, the market falls within the broader industry. The industry is the kind of surrounding framework for the market, and that serves the market of buyers and sellers at the end of the process. Our third term then is competition. Competition is simply the rivalry that exists between different organizations selling similar or substitutable products and or services, and typically in order to achieve a profit. We're going to come back to this a little bit later on when we talk about substitution and similar or same products and services. And then finally, our fourth key term here is regulation. This is the attempt by governments and or various related bodies, it doesn't actually have to be the government itself, to ensure that industries and organizations within the industries comply with relevant legislation. So we're going to unpack some of these terms now in a little bit more detail with some examples, just so that you have a really good firm grasp of what each of these means, because all of these terms are key to understanding what exactly a traditional market is. Okay, let's start with this term market and look at an example just in order to clarify it and get it set in your mind. You might have, for example, a smartphone market in which you have the major sellers like Apple and Samsung. They might sell via their own online stores, or, for example, in the case of Apple especially, they have a huge number of very well and prominently placed Apple stores in major urban locations, or you might find them as well in just regular wholesale retailers, department stores, and so on the main street. And then, of course, you will have the buyers, and the buyers are just your regular consumers, users, the end users of those particular smartphones. An industry then, in contrast, would consist of all of the various steps that lead up to the end user, the end consumer, actually getting their hands on that smartphone. So in the case of, for example, Apple, they would have factories in places like China. They're producing those smartphones from various components. Those manufacturers, who are often contracted by companies like Apple, they would source the components for those smartphones from other companies. And then you've got, for example, transport and logistics, getting those phones from those factories to the sales channels in various countries. You might have, for example, depots in different countries where you keep those smartphones en masse for distribution later. You have as well, of course, the whole advertising and marketing complex surrounding these companies, for example, Samsung, has a very, very aggressive marketing and advertising strategy to try and win back some of that market share from a company like Apple. And of course, then you have the final distribution channels and the sales channels that I've already mentioned. So you can see here, the industry is a much broader idea, a broader concept, which contains within it the marketplace or the market for smartphones. What about competition? What I'm going to do here in order to explain further and to understand further what exactly competition is, we're going to present you with a question, and I want you to think about this and see if you can figure out whether or not the following is or is not an example of competition. Mary is considering how to spend a £100 voucher for the Court department store that she received for her birthday. She's torn between a new scarf from a luxury clothing line, Bernucci, and a new Henko hair straightener. Both items cost close to £100, and so Mary has to choose one product or the other. In this example, are Bernucci and Henko competitors or not? So take a moment there to think about that example, and then we will reveal the answer. Okay, so what do you think? Is this a case of competition between Henko and Bernucci, or is it not a case of competition? If you said no, then you were correct. The companies are selling two completely different products that serve different customer needs. Competition is not subjective. This is something that you have to bear in mind. It requires that the companies are selling the same product types that serve the same needs. The important point here is that the need is the same one being served. In the example that we give here, Mary is actually choosing between two different needs. You have the hair straightener on the one hand, which of course serves the need of straightening her hair, and then you have the scarf, which of course is serving the need of keeping one's neck warm. So they're very distinct needs, and so you can't really conceive of this as a case of competition, even though Mary can only spend the £100 on one product or the other. So ultimately, only one company is going to benefit from Mary's £100. Nevertheless, you cannot say that the two are actually competing. They need to be selling similar products or services that serve the same customer need. What about regulation? We're going to do the same here again in the case of regulation, just to get you to really grasp this concept and to understand the difference between regulation and things that are not examples of regulation. So consider the following case. After a near miss at an airport in capital city, Normanland's Bureau of Air Safety issues a set of guidelines and recommendations regarding how air traffic controllers and pilots ought to conduct themselves on the taxiways and runways at Normanland's airports. The guidelines are voluntary, but are still adopted by all major airlines in Normanland. So the question is the above an example of regulation? Okay, so take a moment to think about that, and we will reveal the answer shortly. Okay, so again, the correct answer is in the negative. This is not a case of regulation in the traditional sense. Guidelines and recommendations alone are not sufficient to count as regulation, even if they are coming from official bodies. They have to be enforced, and they have to be backed by a threat of punishment, or in some cases, financial fines. So they have to be backed by legal force. They can't simply be these kind of airy-fairy recommendations without any real grounding, real foundation in terms of legal force. So regulation has to be conceived of in that sense as having the backing and the force of government from a legal point of view. So let's have a schematic overview here of the traditional market view. It involves organizations making or providing a product and or service to sell for profit. Profit is really a key idea in the traditional market view. We're going to contrast then a little bit later on this with the ecosystem perspective. There is an adversarial relationship between sellers. Adversarial is simply a fancy word for a conflict type relationship between sellers. They view each other as enemies or rivals, and so they tend not to cooperate, they tend not to collaborate, they tend to remain independent of each other in their pursuit for market share and higher profits. The primary focus is on increasing returns to shareholders as well. So profit and returns to shareholders, often those two things go hand in hand, of course. But you've got to bear in mind here, there's a very internal focus here amongst organizations within a traditional market. They're focused only on serving their own shareholders and serving their own customers and generating profits. They don't really have any interest in extracurricular kinds of activities, so to speak. They will do what's necessary, of course, most traditional companies, to fulfill their ethical obligations as well, but their main objectives, their primary objectives, are always going to be to serve their customers, to generate profits, and to generate returns to shareholders. So you can see here on the right, you've got the product or service type. This is defining the market. You have a seller on one side and another seller on the other. They have an adversarial relationship between each other. They're looking to make exchanges with buyers in the marketplace in order to generate a profit. So that is the traditional market view that we're dealing with: adversarial, profit-based, and looking at returns to shareholders. A very useful framework for understanding and interpreting traditional markets is Porter's 5 Forces. This is a scheme that was generated by Michael Porter, and it's one of the best known and most useful frameworks for understanding this traditional market view. Note that Porter's 5 Forces deals with the traditional view of an industry and not just a market. Now, sometimes people use the words market and industry interchangeably, but in this technical and theoretical context, you need to be able to distinguish and differentiate between the two. Try not to use those two terms interchangeably and carelessly in this context. In your CIMA studies, you need to be able to distinguish between the industry and the market, on the other hand. So bear that in mind when you're looking at Porter's 5 Forces. This is a framework for analysing the traditional industry. It comprises 5 categories of forces that determine the level of competition or rivalry in a particular industry, and that is to say the power of all the various stakeholders. Basically, stakeholders means any group or individual within an industry who stands to be affected by, either indirectly or directly affected by, the activities of the organization that's being considered within that industry. So what are Porter's 5 Forces? Well, first of all, we have what's called the threat of new entrants. New entrants increase the level of competition within an industry. Barriers to entry then are features of the industry that make it costly for new entrants to enter. High barriers to entry tend then, of course, to protect profits because it means there are going to be fewer new entrants. On the other hand, then, you have power of suppliers. This is the second of Porter's 5 Forces. When there are very few suppliers in an industry, this tends to result in those suppliers having greater bargaining power. The result then is that the price of inputs will tend to increase. So if you think about it, if you're the only supplier in an industry, then you have really, really strong power vis-a-vis those organizations and companies that are looking to buy your supplies, because of course you can virtually charge whatever you want. You have them captive in a way, and so you can really hike up those prices for those organizations. Whereas if there are many suppliers within the industry and you're one of those suppliers, of course, you can't really charge whatever you want. You're going to be under pressure to keep your prices competitive relative to the other suppliers. The third force then in Porter's 5 Forces is the power of buyers. Features such as relative size and ability to switch to a substitute good or service affects bargaining power. If buyers have strong bargaining power, they can put downward pressure on prices and profits. So if you think about it, of course, if you are a buyer in a particular industry or particular marketplace, you can simply switch over to another good or service. If that's the case, then you're going to be putting increasing pressure on the company that's selling those goods or services, because of course those companies can simply charge whatever they want. They don't have you captive, so to speak. You can go elsewhere with relative ease. So if it's easy for you to switch to another good or service, if the costs to you of switching to another good or service are relatively low, that's going to increase the degree of competition within the industry. It's going to put lots of pressure on those companies within the industry to charge competitive prices. The fourth force then in Porter's 5 forces is the threat of substitutes. A substitute is a different product or service that meets the same customer needs. The availability of substitutes tends to undermine profits because customers can switch. So this is very closely related to number 3, of course, because the availability of other companies offering different products or services but that meet the same customer needs, that is something that is very, very important when it comes to determining the degree of competition, particularly with respect to the prices that these kinds of companies can actually set. And then the 5th force is competition and rivalry itself. And this is closely related then to the number of competitors in the industry and how successful they are in producing something that is compelling to the customer. This is obviously one of the central and key components of determining the level of competition within an industry. But all of these forces coming together are really, really important in determining the degree of overall competition and rivalry within the industry. So the number of companies that are actually selling, this is number 5, the number of companies that are selling and how good the quality of the service or product that they're selling is relative to the other companies within the industry. This is obviously a key and central 5th force determining the overall level of competition within the traditional industry. And so all of these come together to determine how competitive a particular industry, a traditional industry, is. So summing up then, we had those key terms at the beginning: market, industry, competition, and regulation. See if you can remember those now and give a brief definition in your own words of what each of those terms means and how exactly they differ from one another. In the traditional market view then, we saw that there was an adversarial relationship between organizations within the industry or the market, and you also have profits and returns to shareholders being the primary objectives within this view. And finally then we looked at Porter's 5 forces. So can you name the 5 forces that together determine the competitiveness of a traditional industry?